Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for our Ask the Expert series. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thanks for being here. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Today's live Q&A topic is a deep dive into MDR and IVDR device classification and data collection strategies. We're proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory services companies. So how can we help you? As we wind down to the end of 2022, if you have urgent project needs or are looking to learn more about our services, we will be happy to book an appointment with you. You can email us for a free 30-minute consultation at consult@criterionedge.com. You can also book a meeting time directly with the link that we will send in the chat. We have two presenters today. First is Stacy Beecham, Regulatory Affairs Consultant with Criterion Edge. Stacy has a BS in Biology and an MS in Human Physiology with extensive experience in regulatory writing and 10 years of experience in international regulatory affairs. Stacy was a medical researcher prior to entering the regulatory space where she worked with physicians and scientists at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Stacy's expertise in regulatory affairs, submission writing, clinical research, and regulatory consulting for medical device, biopharma, and biotech makes her a valuable asset to our team. Also joining us today is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in Biochemistry and a PhD in Molecular and Cellular Biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for 20 years. Sarah has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Her strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. Welcome both Sarah and Stacy, and now I will turn it over to you to give an overview of our session today.
Hi, everyone. So in today's session, we are going to host a 45-minute live Q&A, mostly because we had so many really good questions after our previous webinar. So today specifically, we want to cover aspects including some of the major changes from MDD and IVDD as a result of the new regulations. We'll also discuss the risk classifications for devices and some of the questions that have been sent in regarding risk assessments and device classifications. And then finally, we'll discuss some of the implications for the risk classifications in terms of your data sufficiency. So what does this all mean in terms of your reporting?
All right, thanks, Sarah. Let's go ahead and get to our first question today. Let me know when you can see it on your screen.
Yep.
All right, our first question today is from Lindsay, and she would like to know how your team keeps themselves healthy with all the rework and stress of being a medical writer.
Yes, so this question made us all laugh because I think everyone who's in charge of the writing aspect of these reports right now is pretty much feeling the same stress. Everyone wants everything completed by the end of the calendar year, and then quickly approaching. I would say the biggest stressor for most of these teams is the reworking, not having all of the pieces of information you need up front and beginning to write an article or a paper or a report and then realizing halfway through that you don't have all of the information or that there's been a change that you were not made aware of. That could be the intended purpose got moved around or reworked by regulatory, or maybe the IFU is being updated, or you're somehow adding or removing a competitor or an indication. All of those things have downstream ripple effects for us as the writers. So I think the major thing is having a really solid team in place to be able to depend on as you're doing the writing, so that when one person has written something, another person can do a quick recheck of it, check all of the details, make sure that you've covered everything, but then also making sure that there's that back and forth dialogue with the people who have all of the supporting documents that are going to go into these reports. Communication is everything on these projects. So getting a solid team who you can trust working with you is first and foremost, that should be your priority right now.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Moving on to our next question from Heather. She's asking, is every device that collects a measurement considered to have a measurement function under the MDR?
I'll take that one. Great question, Heather. So most devices with a measuring function would be considered class 1M, but definitely not all. And I think that a great classification navigation tool, I guess, I'll just pop it in the chat here. I'll pop it in the queue, or let's see, here we go. Is this one that MI3 posted. And it kind of helps you navigate that process of classifying your device. Of course, if there's a higher risk function associated with your measuring device, then you might be in a different category. You might not be in the class 1M category, but it's definitely worth checking into. And then if you have questions about if it's kind of borderline between two different classifications, you can definitely reach out to a notified body or even a consultant to help you navigate that. But if it's a general measuring device, it would be class 1M. Thanks for your question.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Moving on to our next question. Is there any simplifying statement to be given? Are IVD devices still less heavily regulated than MDs?
Yes. So for all of the IVD folks who are in the crowd, I think we're all hoping that the answer to this question is, oh, sure, there's still, it's not nearly as hard, but in a word, it's not. The IVD regulations are going to be just as strict as what the medical device industry went through with the MDR transition. So what we do have the benefit of is their mistakes. So we can learn from what MDD to MDR transition occurred. But I think as you're going into this process, we're used to IVDs being very much less regulated compared to a typical medical device. And that's just not the case anymore. We're going to be held to very strict standards, but we can learn from MDR throughout this process.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question. How detailed should one fill out a GSPR-adressing document leading to classification of a medical device? What are the notified body expectations? Stacy, can you speak a little bit about this?
Sure. I think you're asking two different questions, but I'm not sure, but I'll address both just in case. So as far as GSPRs, generally, we kind of look at the list of GSPRs outlined in the MDR to address, our safety and performance requirements, and you can assess those in light of your device when you are classifying your device, but generally classification comes first. And you would want to go through a classification exercise using that previous link I posted, like a classification guide like that. Or, if it's pretty straightforward, you can just go straight to the guidance into the classification section and look and trying to assess which class you're in and which rules would apply. But if it's not as straightforward, it's nice to use the guides that are out there and the classification guidance that exists to kind of guide you along. And once you know the risk classification for your device and the rules that apply, or the one rule, or maybe multiple rules, or maybe there are multiple rules that could apply and you need help navigating that. Once you know that, then you'll want to go find a GSPR checklist, and there are many available, but I did post one in the chat just for example. And you're going to want to go try to check all those boxes and see if you're meeting all the safety and performance requirements required under the MDR. Note that you will not be able to check all the boxes, especially for the lower risk devices. But for the boxes that you're not able to check, you should provide a justification to why that isn't applicable to your device, or other means that you're going to utilize to address those requirements. So maybe you can address them in post-market studies. Maybe you can address them in other measures that you're taking to show conformity. So the notified body just expects you to do that gap analysis, look at the performance and safety requirements, and address each one in the checklist that's applicable, and then identify those that are not applicable, and then identify the means that you're using to ensure conformity to each of the requirements.
Okay. I think that was some really great guidance. Thanks, Stacy. Our next question is for Sarah, and these two are pretty similar, so I'll put them both up for you. The first one, this person is looking for some guidance on setting up literature searches to get the most pertinent data available on the types of devices. And similarly, this other person is asking, what are some good methods for defining applicable literature search terms?
So yes, so the search strategy that you're going to utilize can be a really important step that I think a lot of people overlook. Particularly, I'm finding with the IVDR arena, we just don't really think about sort of how to narrow the focus of our search. But as part of the systematic literature review process, you are expected to screen all of the results. And you want to ensure that the process is reproducible and very transparent. So you need to develop terms that are going to allow you to capture all of the pertinent data, but are not so broad that you are left screening manually, potentially at thousands of articles. So I typically start by finding several like recommendations or guidelines by reputable organizations like the World Health Organization or EUDC, something like that, where you can identify some of the primary search terms to be on the lookout for. Then I often go to the mesh terms that are used within PubMed to provide some insights. But I would say in this case, having access to a reference librarian who can help you with crafting the proper search terminology and the strings to be able to really focus in on those, collecting the right types of articles will be infinitely helpful. Just in making sure that you are not spending a massive amount of time and energy on screening for a very broad search. Or you may even have the opposite problem where you're having very few hits anytime you run a search. In that case, you may need to expand your search terms and your search, the length of time for your search. But really, as you're trying to clearly define those applicable search terms, the more details you have, and the ability to not just search across PubMed where it's just where you can combine things or say near 3, within 3, things like that will help you really refine that search quite a bit. So our librarians are definitely a major asset.
Definitely, Sarah. And I'd like to remind everyone here that if you'd like to utilize our librarians, you are more than welcome to book an appointment with us. You can schedule some time directly with the link that's in the chat. And moving on to our next question from Vera. What are the typical safety and performance endpoints for the microsurgical devices, such as forceps, scissors, etc.?
Sure, great question. I know it's really difficult to identify the endpoints with these lower risk devices. I know it feels like it's a chore to kind of invent those, but we actually put together a great webinar, and I'm going to pop it in the chat right now, about clearly defining these endpoints for the different classifications of devices. So you should consult that. But another tool, what I like to do, especially for these lower risk class devices, even if you're looking for approval in Europe, you could just as a guide, go to the FDA website, I'm popping that in the chat too, and look for a product that's similar to yours that has been approved, and look at the summary, the approval summary, and see what kind of testing they did. And you know, by the testing that was conducted for those devices, what the endpoints were, right? You know what they're trying to show. For safety, for forceps, for example, you might be dealing with materials leaching, metals, you know, interacting with different fluids and body tissues, right? And you might be dealing with temperature effect. If there is any heat source near the forceps, you know, does it heat up, or is there a measure, a mitigation to prevent them from burning the skin or burning the tissues if heat is nearby, if there's a laser instrument or something that could potentially heat up the forceps. You might be looking at, you know, performance endpoints such as just procedural success. Did the forceps do what they were intended to do? What's the percentage rate for procedural success for those forceps? Are they able to get into the tiny little spaces that they need to get into without tissue damage around that area? You know, it's sometimes just as straightforward as that. Did it accomplish what it was meant to accomplish, or didn't it? If not, what are you going to do to mitigate any risks of tissue and body damage or harm to the patient, or make it more effective next time? You know, what device improvements do you intend to do, you know, based on the data that you have or that you have found that's associated to these types of forceps? So hopefully that helps, and just look into similar products and see what they have done, and kind of gives you a good starting point.
Yeah, I think that was really helpful. Thanks, Stacy. Here's our next question, and this is a good one, Sarah, that we've gotten before. What do you do if you don't have enough clinical evidence?
Yeah, this is a good follow-up to what Stacy just discussed. You know, in many cases for some devices, it's just not very well published. You know, you don't often see a study that's directly comparing the clinical outcome of one forceps versus another. So in many cases, you are relying on clinical practice guidelines, you're relying on recommendations, you're relying on registry data. You know, you have to think about what are any and all sources of clinical evidence and clinical data that exist and are available to you. So don't forget to be on the lookout for that registry data. Not everything necessarily requires a prospective randomized control study in order to obtain the necessary data, but you have to be ready to support the level of clinical evidence that you're providing. And that goes into sort of the concepts behind a well-established technology or a legacy device as well. You know, in many cases, these devices have been on the market for decades. And so if you're only searching within the past 5 years for evidence, you're likely not going to find too terribly much. So you may be relying more heavily on the clinical practice guidelines and organizations that publish those recommendations as a good starting point for identifying the most relevant clinical evidence, because you're still expected to show that your device, while it's been on the market for decades, is it still considered state of the art? That is, so it doesn't negate the need. Just because it's been around for a long time does not necessarily meet that standard of being considered state of the art. You're still expected to provide that justification.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Keep sending in your questions. We have about 20 minutes or so. We'll keep going through as many as we can. Here is our next question, and this is from Tatiana. And Stacy, would you talk a little bit about some data collection options for Class 2A devices?
Sure. You know, I mean, it's kind of the same as for most classifications of devices. You're going to look at registries, like Sarah mentioned, any experience that similar devices have had, right? So clinical data for similar devices, customer surveys, user feedback, those types of post-market activities, post-market studies, and then of course the original data that you collected on the device, if you did that, and if not, the data you relied on for the similar equivalent device. So there are a lot of literature sources, peer-reviewed literature and other literature, published literature that has clinical data available in it. But for a class 2A device, you know, I would say even if it's a limited study, it probably most often requires a clinical study to meet the MDR requirements. There are some cases where you can get away with it if you, especially if you as the manufacturer have a similar device that whose technical data you have full access to. If you have full access to anybody's technical data for a similar device, then you might be able to rely on that and not conduct your own clinical trial.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Here is our next question, Sarah. This one is from Lisi. Should the data collection strategy only include published data, or can it also include literature that is waiting to be published?
So I guess it would depend on the source of the literature and the sort of the status of the literature. If you are talking about sort of in-house information, you can certainly use that as part of your reports. Like if you have specialized reports that have been generated and are awaiting to be published. If it's something like a peer-reviewed journal that is pending publication, but has been accepted, you could also include that, but you want to be clear about the level of appraisal for that particular article. You know, a article that's peer-reviewed is going to be viewed and weighted at a higher level than an article that's you know, published as like a paper or in a conference abstract or something like that, a conference paper, a conference abstract, because they don't go through the same level of peer review as a study that's been published. So, you know, be careful with your appraisal of that particular article, but you could still use it depending on the source.
Okay, great, thanks. So Stacy, this next one is a bit technical. Can you speak a little bit about the implementation or correlation of ISO 14971:2019 and ISO 10993-1/2018 in MDCH 2021-24 and MDCG 2020-16?
Sure. Yep. That's a great question. So 14971, for anyone who doesn't know, relates to your risk management program. And then 10993 relates to biocompatibility and other patient safety factors, right? Chemical characterization testing and things like that. The lucky thing here is both of those standards have been harmonized, which means that they've been universally accepted by most countries. So they are harmonized standards. There's an international group that works to harmonize them and make sure that the requirements align in the various countries involved in that group. And then the MDCG guidance, both of those guidances mentioned there, kind of help interpret what the requirements are for each of those standards. I'm going to post in the chat a really great blog post related to your risk management program, or, you know, requirements around risk management and how the MDR is specifying what needs to go back, you know, what needs to be backed into your risk management program if you had a solid risk management plan before the MDR was implemented, you know, what changes you need to make to update that. And then if you're just in the process of creating a risk management plan, you know, it also outlines the requirements that you should follow. So that's one good resource. And then for biocompatibility and chemical characterization, I think the MDCG guidance addresses that around the basic patient safety requirements that the MDR, and you know, they're not very different between the FDA and the MDR. So that's nice, but we can expect that all countries will follow suit with these requirements. And we do know that the FDA and the MDR and the EC have heightened their requirements around biocompatibility, tissue interaction, temperature effect for tissues, and all of those different leaching. We're talking about extractables and leachables is a big topic in Europe now. What's coming off of the device, what metals are leaching into the bloodstream and leaching into might be absorbed by surrounding tissues. So it's a really hot topic, and it's great to try to follow anything you can that's talking about it, because we can't understand enough about these new requirements around safety. They said safety is mentioned 5 times more frequently in the MDR than it was in the MDD. So we know that this is something that the EC is really honing in on. Great question. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Stacy. Here is our next question. How important is IVD and LDT laboratories in the US and Canada?
So this has actually been a topic that has come up quite a bit. I think because most of the folks who have these lab developed tests have really gotten away without having to go through any sort of certification, much like the rest of the IVD manufacturers. So the important thing to start by pointing out is that LDT, a lab developed test, is covered under the new IVDR. The IVDR does not carve out like an exception for a lab developed test, but it also doesn't actually use the term lab developed test. It doesn't specify where or what's considered a lab developed test versus a commercial test. So the lab developed test would be basically anything that's been developed by or conducted by a health institution. So if you have an in-house test that you use in your pathology or something to that effect. And you also have some of these hospital systems that are offering testing services, and those will be covered under the IVDR Article 6. So they're treated just the same way as if that IVD was actually being sold commercially. So even though an LDT is not specifically defined in IVDR, it is covered by IVDR. And so in order to be exempt from your CE marking, you basically have to have an in-house IVD that does not have equivalent CE marked device on the market. If there's no equivalent CE marked IVD on the market, you may be able to claim exemption. And as you're going through the whole process and coming to terms with the fact that you may actually be required to submit for certification under IVDR, use the same risk classification system that would apply to a commercial IVD for your LDT.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Our next question is from Laura. And she's asking if you could speak a little bit about what to do for borderline or low risk products, such as those also considered as daily living aids like wheelchairs.
Sure. I'm not sure, actually, Laura, if I'm assuming you're asking about clinical data, so I'm going to speak to that. I'm not sure if this would be considered a borderline device or not, but I would consult, and I'll put this in the chat, the manual on borderline classification for medical devices, to see whether it is, to indeed assess, is my device a borderline device, or is it a class 1 daily living aid device? Now, clinical data for class 1 or daily living aid devices where not a lot of adverse events are likely reported and not a lot of data is collected on these types of things, it's tough. It's really tough. You're going to have to use a combination of, the bench testing that was done on the various components of that device, and then the real world usage surveys of different patients and healthcare practitioners that are in frequent contact with your device in a real world setting. It's going to have to be a combination, a collection of different types of data to show conformity to the MDR for this. Luckily, it is a low risk device with minimal skin contact, or, it's non-invasive, things like that. So I think the notified bodies, generally speaking, understand where you're coming from, that it's just not feasible to collect, to really do an extensive clinical study, but the real world data will be a huge factor for you. And then, of course, associated data that's available through literature that you could use based on similar devices.
Okay, great. Thanks. Our next question is from Romuald, and Sarah, I think you can take this one. Is QMS required for Annex 16 devices according to MDR? If yes, is it required to create QMS according to EN 13485, or is ISO 9001 enough?
So I just did a little bit of digging just to make sure I'm telling you the most up-to-date information. Generally speaking, those annex, those devices covered under that particular annex are the ones that often were not covered or even considered to be a medical device until recently. So now that they do fall under the MDR requirements, I would suggest that you can refer to the Article 10 of the MDR. That's where it's going to go into details about what exactly QMS is required. Generally speaking, though, most requirements are covered if you go under that ISO 13485. So that tends to be the easier or the more straightforward approach. You can, with proper justification, you can attempt to use the ISO 9001, but generally speaking, they're very familiar with the 13485. That seems to be the most common approach to QMS. So if at all possible, I would definitely suggest taking a look and seeing if that 13485 is feasible.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question for Stacy. What if a class 3 implantable legacy device does not have clinical data? Would you recommend conducting a clinical investigation on the device, or can we rely on the clinical data of similar devices in the market?
Great question. So I'm not sure. There are a few nuances in this question that, it's kind of an if-then scenario, but a legacy device is a device that was previously approved under the MDD. And what has not changed between the MDD and the MDR is that class 3 devices require a clinical study, right? So to get that initial approval under the directives, if it was at that time a class 3 implantable device, I think that you must have had clinical data that was specific to the device. However, there's a chance, I'm guessing, that your device has been reclassified, perhaps, in which case maybe you don't have so much clinical data available. But whatever you use to get the initial MDD certification, you would use that collection of data, and then you will likely, since it's now at least a class 3 implantable device, have to do some post-market studies. There's really no situation that I know of where a class 3 implantable device doesn't require device specific data. But if you do have the previous generation, or even a new generation that has been approved under the MDR or recently approved under the MDD, and you can rely on similar device data that is one of your own devices, same manufacturer, that's a possibility. But in most cases, like 98% of the time, a class 3 implantable device will need device specific data, and you'll have to do your own study for that particular device.
All right. Keep sending in your questions. We have just under 10 more minutes left in our time here today. We'll keep going through as many as we can. Here is our next question. Are the class designations for devices in IVD the same or similar for Europe versus the US and the rest of the world?
So There will be some potential changes, especially as we made the jump between MDD and MDR. We saw that there were actually some devices that were classified as a low risk. So like an MDR class 1 for sterile devices or measuring devices, they actually were classified as a class 2 under the FDA. And there were also some of the MDR class 2B medical devices that got bumped up to a class 3, according to the FDA. So be on the lookout for that. So far for the IVD world, we don't have quite as much detail or clarity, but generally speaking, the FDA tends to, if it's going to, if you're doing a direct comparison, the FDA will be the ones who tend to overestimate and bump you up a risk class compared to the MDR. So I would say that, trying to go strictly by the guidance and making sure that you're referring to both sets of guidances to not just assume that it's going to be a direct correlation would be a safe bet.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question, Stacy. This is a unique one. Are there any differences or flexibility for class 1 devices that have been on the market for 30 years?
Sure. I'm guessing that it's a legacy device since it's been on the market for 30 years, guessing that it's certified under the MDD. And if that's the case, then the flexibility is that you can use surveys and post-market clinical follow-up and things like that to beef up your clinical documentation for your CER. Differences for class 1 devices, the key differences are that several of them have been reclassified up to class 2A or 2B. And then there are 4 different designations under the class 1, like subdivisions, subsets of the classification. So you've got the sterile classification, the measuring, the reusable, and then the general class 1 devices. So those are new distinctions that the MDR calls out. And for each of those, they have different sub requirements. They're not, hugely burdensome, but they're something to address in your CER. You need to reclassify your device if any of those categories apply. So those are some of the key differences. And then the flexibility lies in the fact that it is low risk and that it's been on the market for 30 years. So you can collect some post-market follow-up information. And that's probably all that's required.
All right, thanks, Daisy. Here's our next question from Stina. And they're asking, how would you apply classification rules and product codes to integral drug delivery devices?
So we just got some insights into this. It's actually, if you look at this Article 117, so 117 of the MDR, it's an amendment to the previous annex. And that's what helps you to clarify the requirement for notified body involvement if you have a medicinal product that actually has an integrated medical device. So when you look at the MDR, basically in order to meet these standards and to be considered one of these a medicinal product that actually is considered to form an integral product within the medical device, that's going to be where you're going to say, did your delivery device and the medicinal product form a single product? Is it only intended to be used in combination, and is it a single use only? So when you're developing that and you're trying to determine your risk classification, clearly a drug that is designed to be delivered in a syringe is going to be met with a higher risk classification than a syringe that is empty. So in that case, I would go with the higher risk classifications and to make sure that you always err on the side of the higher of the two. So this might be a place where you will definitely want to consult with your notified body to ensure that you're meeting that sort of higher level or higher standard.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question from Michelle. As software safety is one of the newest requirements, what is the best approach to calculate the probability of a software failure?
Great question, Michelle, and thanks for bringing up software. I'm going to loop in some other information into this question. So software under the MDR is generally classified as 2A, and there are, of course, exceptions. And, you know, there's some great resources. The standard that you're going to want to follow, I just posted in the chat, because that is also a harmonized standard. So it's recognized worldwide for the countries that participate in the harmonization process. And then also, I think I just posted the wrong one in the, I didn't mean to post that blog there, you guys, so disregard, but risk management for software is included in the blog post that I just sent, but there's another one that I'll send to. Software verification testing, according to the MDR, needs to link to hazards identified for the software and or hardware interface. Software lifecycle development is key for managing hazards and cybersecurity. Interoperability with other software controlled devices and connectivity via Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and networks should be addressed. And the software shall be developed with the state of the art. So given those requirements that are outlined in the MDR, your verification testing should follow the standard that I put in the chat, which is a harmonized standard between the EU, US, and several other countries. And then beyond that, you'll need to address each of the bullet points that the MDR outlines around software verification.
All right, thanks, Stacy. I think we have time for one last question. This question is from Samantha, and she's asking for a device with multiple functions that includes both medical device and in vitro device in a single device. Which regulation would preside?
So as you're looking at sort of the differences between IVD and the medical device, definitely look into just sort of the basic definitions. You know, a IVD is a medical device that's used in vitro, so on a sample of human origin that is outside of the human body. And it's used to make a determination of a clinical condition or a physiological state, whereas a medical device is actually you know, inside of the body. It's integrated inside the body, and it can be used for the purpose of diagnosis, but there can be some areas that are a little bit more nuanced, and that was the purpose behind the most recent guidelines that were just published. We actually just received these, and I'll pop these in the chat. We just received these in September. They're starting to populate. You'll actually notice quite a few of these borderline devices are still not populated fully because we're currently awaiting additional guidances. But we should be getting those fairly soon here. Generally speaking, look to, you know, in most cases, it seems like if they're erring on the side of it being invasive, it would classify under a medical device. If it's on tissue outside of the body, it would be an in vitro device. That's sort of the general rule, but there are going to be some of these really sort of nuanced, tricky ones. So the guidance that I just posted hopefully will help to cover some of the questions that you have about your particular device.
And Sarah, I'll add to that, you know, we've done a lot of work over the years on like drug-eluting stents or drug medical device combination products. And in that case, you're really reporting on two separate entities, on two separate separate regulations. You're addressing them both. And this might be a case where if it's both an MD and an IVD, that you're probably reporting on two different platforms there, and that might be required for some of these borderline devices. They might be combination devices where you're addressing both regulation, you know, requirements from both of the regulations.
All right, we are out of time. I see that there's still a couple questions in the queue. Our specialists have set some time aside specifically for our attendees today to continue answering your questions. We can also meet with you to discuss any of your upcoming project needs. You're more than welcome to send us an email to consult@criterionedge.com to schedule this appointment. You can also book a meeting time directly with the link in the chat. If you enjoyed this webinar, you may want to sign up for our webinar notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming events. You can use your cell phone camera to scan this QR code and we will add you to our webinar notifications list. Thank you again, Sarah and Stacy, for your time today, and everyone for joining us. Take care, and I hope to see you at our next webinar. Have a great rest of your day.